a discussion in terms of responsibilities and roles as citizens and also as pet owners. So this afternoon, we're going to be talking about the safety and control measures for keeping domestic and wild animals, particularly in a residential environment where we've seen several incidents recently of pit bulls in particular, attacking passers-by or neighbors. And there are a number of heated arguments taking place, but primarily we need to be looking at the responsibilities and the roles of owners, those of people in the trade of animals, and what responsibilities, according to the law, we have as citizens in terms of the housing and control of animals in a suitable environment. So to start off the discussion today, we have representatives from the NSPCA, and that's the National Council for the Societies of the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. This is a non-profit organization, and they are responsible for preventing cruelty and promoting the welfare of all animals in order to ensure that we don't have environments in which animals are subjected to cruelty, but also environments that are safe for us as citizens in the country, as especially for young children, that we don't find ourselves in conflict with animals in particular environments. So I would like to introduce to you Mr. Nazareth Appelsamy and Mr. Douglas Voliter, who will be speaking to us on the importance of maintaining an environment and the importance of ensuring that we have an environment that's suitable for animals of this nature. And they'll also be speaking to the comments about banning the animals and also some of the incidents where communities have taken laws into their own hands in terms of trying to retaliate against either the owners or the animals themselves. So, Mr. Appelsamy, I'd like to start with you, please, sir.
Good afternoon, Joanne. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. If you can speak to us a little bit about the approach that the NSPCA is taking on this matter, and also the importance of understanding the environments in which such animals need to be kept.
Okay. So I'll start by saying that we believe that if you have to own an animal, regardless of the breed, you have to be responsible. You have to understand the breed itself. And I know that training is an aspect that has come up, but training is certainly important. And you know that dogs have no concept of right and wrong, and therefore it is important that one trains an animal. And more importantly, with regards to training, is developing a bond between a human bond between animal and human, and that strengthens the relationship, and also making the animal more obedient to commands, and this whereby you will have control over the animal. So we certainly believe that wants to own an animal, he certainly, which is more important than training, we believe, is actually researching the breed that he or her wants to have and understanding its behavior. And of course, then you will need the premises, you would need adequate space, you would need to dedicate time, because remember, it is not just adopting a pet, it is adopting a family member where you will have to spend adequate time with this animal. And this is important because the more time you spend with the animal, the more socialized it becomes, and the more you are able to understand its behavior.
Thank you very much. Many people have been calling for the banning of pit bulls in particular, but I suppose that would start to extend then to other animals, keeping in mind that many people keep these kinds of dogs for their own safety and protection, or the protection of property. How do we maintain a balance between keeping animals as a means of security, but also ensuring that they then don't become a nuisance animal in the environment that they're in?
Thank you, Joanne. So you're quite right. The country at the moment is divided. We have owners that own pit bulls that I will certainly say that they are excellent dogs. And then we have victims and the family of victims that have lost loved ones through attacks. And right now, it is important to understand that we do not support the ban. We never have, and we certainly do not support a ban of any breed. What we do support call for stronger regulations, the calls for stronger laws for the owning of such animals. And this is what we would like local government and national government to implement. In South Africa, unfortunately, there is no law regarding to the breeding or keeping of animals. And this is why municipalities across the country have municipal bylaws for those that have. And the challenges with municipal bylaws is that sometimes it is not always enforced or easily enforced. And this is why we are calling for national law and stronger regulations. There's clearly a race by certain municipalities to review the current bylaws for the keeping of vicious animals. But for those owners who understand the breed, they've researched it, they understand its behavior, they understand that it is easily aroused, and they know how to control the animal. And basically, it's almost micromanaging an animal if you want to own such a power breed. And if you are committed and dedicated, and you have spent enough time with the animal, and you are quite certain that the animal is safe around kids and around members that don't belong to the family, then you are in a position to not be so concerned about this because your animal is well taken care of.
Thank you. I'd like to ask, what is the capacity of either the National Council of SPCAs or particular SPCAs in areas around the country in terms of being able to deal with such nuisance animals? We've heard reports of people calling for the SPCA to come and remove animals, to receive animals. And one wonders, in terms of capacity and roles, whether the NSPCA or whether the individual units have capacity in terms of enforcing this, and to what extent would you become involved when these animals are not necessarily within the ownership or the regulation of animals by the NSPCA?
So, Jan, the NSPCA is the largest animal welfare organization in Africa. We enforce the Animals Protection Act, which deals specifically with the protection of animals. So that's where our mandate lies. Currently, if we're talking about the protection of the public, that rests with government. The SPCA movement in South Africa accepts all animals. Our doors are always open, and we will never, ever refuse an animal. The attacks in the country has caused panic and has caused citizens to relook at their current animals and wonder if they have the capacity and the knowledge and skills to own such an animal. This has placed a huge burden on SPCAs all across the country in so far that our resources right now are currently being challenged. There's financial restrictions, and I must reiterate that we are a non-profit organization and that we receive no funding from government. So SPCAs across the country are dealing with the large amount of animals that are coming through their doors as best as they can. And this is why we are looking towards government to provide immediate intervention.
Right. Thank you. Yes, definitely having to deal with such a large area of responsibility, and I'm sure the general public not necessarily understanding the scope and role of your functions. I think many people simply think, well, these are the people we call when we want to complain, and the police are not necessarily answering. But it is a very complicated role. I think maybe if we could ask Mr. Douglas Voliter just to speak to us briefly. You used the word vicious when referring to these animals, and most certainly the recent attacks, that is an appropriate label. But there are many people who have spoken in defense of pit bulls in particular, but of dogs, large dogs, and there are a number of breeds that we've seen internationally that people have labeled as not suitable as domestic pets or to have in family environments. But when we start to differentiate between animals which maybe have a particularly aggressive nature and then animals that are wild, maybe you could give us just a little bit of insight there in terms of how we differentiate in terms of dealing with such animals. We know that there are environments where people keep fairly exotic pets that their neighbors might deem wild or vicious, but many of these animals have been bred in domestic environments. And what is the thinking around that in terms of appropriate animals to have in a domestic residential environment, as opposed to animals being kept in a formalized zoo or in a formalized enclosure, which very, very clearly separates humans and animals?
Thank you, Joanne. That's a really good question. I think up here in Gauteng on the East Rand, we're seeing a lot of it, and it's a huge problem where people are keeping tigers as domestic pets. I must just state right at the forefront that the council remains opposed to the keeping of any as a pet. There has been failings where there's been very little restriction on exotic animals coming into the country. Tigers are obviously exotics. They're native to India and other countries. So there's very little restriction on them here, apart from import permits and through different provinces. The problem is if we're talking about, and there's been talk about this, where the classification of a pit bull as a wild, to be made as a wild animal, to be classified as one. There's a huge problem with that because firstly, at the moment, until NEMBA has been amended, will come into practice, the mandate for welfare stays with DELROD, with the Department of Land Reform, Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development. So the mandate in terms of wildlife isn't quite resting with the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and the Environment currently. As a result, there's going to be a cross-section where nothing's going to happen because the mandate for welfare is going to pass between one or the other. And in the meanwhile, you've got animals living in very unacceptable conditions. We don't, even when you're looking at a small animal like a chinchilla, which is a little squirrely type animal, a lot of people, well, it's small, we can just keep it in a room. And unfortunately, even with chinchillas, they come from high altitude areas. They require good nesting spaces. They're very sociable creatures. And these are the type of things that we've got to look at, where you can't emulate that in a captive environment. Already in in formalized settings, when we inspect those, we're actually giving advice on environmental enrichment, trying to make the habitat more natural to the animal. And again, then we bring back pit bulls, and we want to make pit bulls wildlife. Already there's a massive competency issue between ourselves as well as nature conservation officials. We do not have the capacity. Sorry, it is capacity I'm talking about. We don't have the capacity already to inspect all the wildlife facilities. If you're going to take a pit bull and you want to put regulations in terms of permitting, in terms of an indigenous animal, I'm afraid we're going to fall very, very hard on our faces, because we're not going to get that. We're not going to get that right. Historically, there were dog licensing, which happened to help control dog movements, dog diseases, and that's not even in place anymore. So, my whole point of view is that a domestic animal cannot be reclassified as a wild animal, and that's the end of it all. And if we do that, we are seriously heading to a big failure in terms of compliance and enforcement.
Yes, definitely. As much as we'd like to look for an easy road in this, it does impact in both ways on those who are concerned with the management of wildlife, of true wild animals, and those who are concerned with the welfare of domesticated animals. Mr. Appelsamy, I'd like to ask you just to come in. Mr. Voliter touched on the aspect of enrichment, and there have been suggestions that some of these animals are responding in the way they're responding because they don't have sufficient enrichment, and that the onus is on the owner of the animal to provide suitable enrichment. But is that really a factor? And how would people find out more about providing the kind of enrichment or entertainment maybe for animals who are mostly confined during the day?
Thank you. So yeah, enrichment is certainly important, not just for dogs and cats, but for all animals that are confined or are being cared for. And we've seen it that if an animal has only its teeth to defend itself and it has no interaction amongst human beings, the animal is either then forced to do one of two things: either to behave in a scared behavior or in an aggressive behavior or uncertainty. So it is important to understand that an animal, if you want to own an animal, it has to be socialized. You have to spend time with it. And of course, having the animal rather locked up in there's a lot of people out there that have this animal locked up in a tiny cage, and they are opened only at night for the protection of property. And there are animals out there, well, a lot of them that are chained. They spend their entire lives on chain. And when they spend so much time on chains, and eventually when they do get opened, and then that is like, and I know that the media have said it and calling the pit bull a loaded weapon. And perhaps that's not always true, but the reality is that an animal should have the ability to express normal behavior. And we always promote the 5 freedoms when it comes to owning animals: and freedom to be free, freedom to express normal behavior, access to water and food, and of course, love and attention. Because it's not just an animal. We would like to think that domestic animals are pets. They should be loved for and cared for by family members and treated humanely. And I think that there's a lot of animals out there that are not cared for adequately. In fact, the complete opposite. They are kept in cruel conditions, and they are treated inhumanely. And I think this certainly plays a role in the behavior and aggression of that animal.
All right. Thank you very much. So I'm going to invite attendees to the webinar today to post your questions onto the Q&A facility or onto the chat. Any questions that you have for the National Council of SPCA, Society of Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, questions pertaining to either domestic or wild animals, and whether there are any discussion points that you'd like to find out, whether you'd like to find out more information about the society itself. I would welcome you to place any comments or ask any questions either on our chat facility or on the Q&A. I think moving on to our next panelist, the issue of laws and national legislation as opposed to bylaws, the need for legislation that deals with animals as domestic animals versus wild animals, and possibly also regulation of owners and breeders, brings us to the sticky point of the actual law pertaining to these issues. And our next panelist is Ms. Lungelo Mokoena. She is going to be speaking to us about the legal ramifications of an animal that is owned in a domestic environment, attacking, biting either a member of the family, a passerby. What are the responsibilities of the owner, and possibly what the law needs to be looking at in terms of regulating this? Is it sufficient for us to just have a bylaw? Is it necessary for us to have national law, and national law that maybe speaks to a particular breed, or in general in terms of pet ownership and responsibilities of ownership? So if we can hand over to you, Ms. Mokoena, please.
Thank you so much, Joanne. My name is Lungelo. I am practicing at Gcis Attorneys. And yeah, so this is just my, my brief overview of my understanding of the law insofar as it relates to animals. So as the owner of a domestic animal, you have the responsibility over the animal itself, but you also have responsibility over any potential liability that may arise owing to such ownership. The potential liability arising out of this ownership is not dependent on fault. And what I mean by this is that whether or not it was your fault that the animal attacked someone else or not, that doesn't matter. You still retain liability over whatever harm that your animal has caused. This, however, does not mean that as an owner of a domestic animal, you should be negligent in how you handle your animal. Legally, the standard of care in respect of how you handle such a domestic animal is measured by reasonableness. So the question that's then asked is, would a reasonable person have allowed for an otherwise vicious dog to roam the streets in the instance of a pit bull? Because, now the whole thing is that pit bulls are vicious and therefore you should have kept it on a leash. So that, the standard, like I said, is one of reasonableness. There are instances when the harm resulting from the attack of a domestic animal becomes an exception to the rule. So, for example, if a domestic animal attacks an intruder or a trespasser, then the standard which these attacks are measured tips the scale to a degree. And it then raises the issue of lawfulness, and this is what I'd like to deem as a silent requirement to the requirements that we look at when you want to bring a claim against an owner of an animal. So lawfulness speaks to the presence of a person on a property, right? So, and this requirement on its own is dealt with by the courts in a matter of Van den Venture, versus Botha, where an applicant or the applicant's husband was bitten by the respondent's dog while the respondent was on his property. So the applicant's husband was on the respondent's property and he was attacked by the respondent's dog. So there is lawfulness because there was permission by the respondent to be on the property. It turned out later that the applicant would then pass away owing to the injuries. So for an injury to be actionable, the person who has sustained such injuries needs to have been lawfully on the property or not trespassing. And now going on to the requirements that are, or the generally known requirements for bringing an action where you were attacked by a dog. This action or a claim that you use to bring an action against the owner of a dog is called the actio di per peri. I might be pronouncing it wrong, but it's actio di per peri. There are 4 main requirements for this action. The first 2 are very straightforward because they're factual. And the first being that the person that you're claiming from needs to be the actual owner of the domestic animal. The second requirement is that the animal itself needs to be classified as a domestic animal. So those 2 are requirements that can be easily satisfied because that information can be easily ascertained. The problem then comes in when we have to deal with the second 2 requirements in satisfying this whole test. The last 2 requirements is that in causing the harm, the domestic animal must have been deemed to act contrary to the nature of what domestic animals would act like. And the last of these requirements is that there must have been a causal link between the harm that was sustained and the conduct of the animal. And I'm going to deal with just these last 2 because they're the ones that generally pose issues or cause issues for us when we are in court and when we are dissecting the issues of a dog bite or, being attacked by an animal. So the third requirement in unpacking it, which is that an animal acted contrary to its nature as a domestic animal. There was a matter that was dealt with in court at Solomon versus Deval, where the court had to consider injuries that were caused by a horse. So essentially what was said here is that evidence was led to state that a stallion would generally attack strange male horses in order to protect the interests that it has in its female company. So the court said that this behavior is no different to when a mule kicks when they're upset by the noise that's being caused by traffic. So overall, what we can take away from the court in this decision is that conduct by an animal must be contra naturam sui generis. It's a Latin phrase generally saying that the conduct should not or is contrary, depending on which side of the coin you're arguing. Conduct of the animal was contrary to the conduct of how animals of this nature generally behave. So it's a very sticky subject because if you then look at pit bulls, is that how dogs generally behave? That's the question we then ask ourselves. And with the nature of how animals have been reported, particularly pit bulls have been reported to act, one can simply argue that that's not how a domestic animal has been behaving. And if you are the owner of a pit bull, you'll then get liability because that's not how a pit bull generally should be behaving. And like Mr. Nazareth and Mr. Douglas correctly stated that if you don't place an animal in a social setting, and you always chain the animal, and the moment that the animal gets to be freed, it may act contrary to what it should be acting like because it doesn't get the freedom that it needs to get on a daily basis. And then in unpacking the final requirement that the conduct of the dog or the animal must have caused harm, it's a general requirement that you need to satisfy, and it speaks of a causal link. So where there is a clear bite, a dog bite that was sustained by a person who is bringing an action, it goes without saying. But sometimes it does get complex, and you just hear very complex matters in court, and you're just like, but there's no causal link actually. But that's generally a case-by-case thing, and that's for the courts to decide when the time does come. And as a defendant or as a person who owns an animal, you have the right to defend an action if it is brought against yourself because you own a particular animal. So if you are disputing any wrongfulness on the part of your animal, you then need to show sufficient grounds to this denial. And the following 3 are grounds on which you can bring a defense. And the first would be provocation. So you can prove to the court that the animal in acting out of the ordinary was provoked by the other person. So if you're going to hit a dog or you are going to throw stones at it and it bites you, you sort of kind of did it to yourself. So that's one of the instances where you can negate liability as the owner of an animal to say this dog was provoked and therefore it acted because it needed to protect itself. However, provocation not only comes from the person who sustained injuries. For example, if a third party provokes an animal, if another animal provokes your animal, if you are the person against whom a claim is brought, you can always say, but my dog was provoked by a third party. So why is illegal action being brought against me when this dog was claimed again, this dog was provoked by someone else? So that, that's more on a technical level. But the first defense that you can always bring up is the issue of provocation. And then the person, just as a general thing, a person who brings up a defense has the onus of proving it in court. So if you're saying that your dog was provoked, you need to prove it in court. But again, that's also on a technical level where we then deal with it in practice when we are sitting with a client and we're trying to put together a case for you. The second defense would then be being lawfully at a premise, which I did speak to earlier. And essentially, you had the right to be there, and therefore the dog just attacked you because the owner was not, careful with the dog or was negligent to not ensure that the dog does not go either on your property, or if you are on the owner's property, they just didn't take enough steps to ensure that this dog would not behave in a manner that is threatening to a person who was lawfully meant to be on a particular property. And the final defense that we look at is that the person who came onto your property accepted the fact that there is risk of being attacked by this animal, and they still proceeded. I know that is also a very touch and base type of thing, because if I say to you, no, come in, my dog doesn't bite, and then my dog bites you, you know what I mean? I, in a way, created for you the illusion, for lack of better wording. I created the illusion that you can come on my property and that you will be safe. So, but otherwise, just in general, if you don't have my permission and we're friends and you're thinking, the dog is not going to do anything, you come on my property and the dog bites you, you accepted the risk that attaches with coming onto my property. And so this goes together with placing an indemnity warning signage at the entrance of your premise, so that whoever wants to come onto your premise is aware of the fact that there is an animal on this property and the risk of being harmed does exist. And if you do enter without permission, and even if there wouldn't be issue with you attaining permission, you do run the risk of having been attacked by the animal that resides on the property. I think
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Yes, that's quite a bit of legal background that could come into play. I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question in terms of the responsibilities for the owner for keeping an animal in a contained environment, and I'm using that in terms of requirements to have a fence that's maybe X number of meters high, or requirements to separate the area where the animal is kept from the general frontage of the property, so that the dog doesn't jump over a low gate to attack people who are in the municipal area of the yard, maybe on that front section of the pavement and so on. And whether there is any kind of legislation in terms of the responsibility of the owner to keep an animal in an appropriate space or in an appropriate way. We've heard both from both the gentlemen that a dog needs to be kept in an environment in which it has some form of stimulation, in which it has comfort and shelter and food and water, and what are the requirements, if any, from a legal point of view on the owner as a preventative measure. I think we've now, I think many people were looking for an outlet in terms of what happens after the event, but also how could this have been prevented from a legislative point of view?
I think with most municipalities there exist bylaws. So each municipality, I mean, some municipalities do it and some don't. In fact, I think one that I've read up on was in the Western Cape, but it was very short and it didn't necessarily deal with the keeping of domestic animals. So at a national level, we do not have legislation that confidently says, you know, this is how high your wall should be, this is how much caution you should exercise, this is what you should do. And there's a need then for the legislature to go back to Parliament and to table these things, because it is an issue. But are we also then going to say to people who are dog lovers, you shouldn't keep a particular dog because your particular dog poses harm on people? You know what I mean? So if there is then a need for legislature to go back to the drawing board and to rework this whole situation, because with bylaws, and this is just my opinion, with bylaws, they are not as strictly enforced as they should be. They're not as strictly enforced as they would if a bylaw was, for example, made into the legislature that is applicable throughout the country. But as the owner of an animal, you know if your dog is naughty and your dog tends to jump over a certain length type of wall. So the responsibility and the onus then shifts on you to ensure that you put in place measures that are sufficient to protect your dog and to protect people in the community, because dogs do escape. But what are the measures that you as a dog owner have put in place? You know what I mean? So it also goes back to the issue of reasonableness. Is it reasonable for you to build a wall that's this high, knowing that your dog can jump over it? So those are the issues that we then face when we go to court. You'll say, yeah, but I did something. You didn't do enough. So it can always go back to the question of, but you didn't do enough. The responsibility ultimately lies with you, because you're the one that took the responsibility of having this animal and adopting this animal. Now it's on you. Joanne, you are on mute, just by the way.
Thank you so much. Yes, responsibility of ownership. And I was commenting on the fact that we need to remember that animals are not just gifts to be given away at Christmas time and birthdays. It's actually taking responsibility for the future actions of that animal in the same way as we would for a child, I suppose.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you so much. I'd now like to open for questions. If there are any questions that people would like to raise, if there are any hands that people would like to raise, or if they would like to pose questions to any of our panelists. Vanessa, maybe if you can tell us if we can see any hands being raised.
No hands have been raised so far.
All right. Okay, I see there is a question that has been added into our Q&A. Right, so we have a question from News 24. They're asking about the recording and the panelists' names. Certainly, we'll be able to share those with you. So, Vanessa, if you can take note there. I think if we could ask our panelists just all to come back again and maybe just give us a sense of what they would like to see, what they feel is reasonable and necessary in the case of animals going forward. The case that you gave as an example, Lungelo, in terms of a horse, we were focused on pit bulls, but I'm sure that there's a fair amount of damage that can be done by a horse that's kept in a domestic situation. And possibly when we look at large properties that are still within easy travel of a large metro and people that may be traversing those properties. maybe there is a need for us to look broader than the animals that are currently posing the greatest threat. So if I could start off with you, Mr. Appelsamy, Nazareth from the National Council of SPCAs, an ideal situation for you or a way going forward.
Yeah, thank you. So I think Lungelo touched on the legal aspect, and perhaps I could add that victims of dog attacks do have legal recourse in the fact that they can, they should, and they must go to their nearest police station and open a case in terms of the Animal Matters Amendment Act, which is Act 42 of 1993. And this is the only way we will actually have an idea and to deal with these dog attacks or animal attacks in the country. So I think it's just an appeal to the public out there. And I know that there's been many victims over a very lengthy period that have been paid off by owners in fear, or have paid off hospital bills. And I just want to appeal to them that the law does provide recourse, and that any person who is attacked by an animal through negligence of an owner, that they must report it to the nearest police station. I also want to add, and something I perhaps missed out earlier, is that we have to understand that the pit bull itself, was bred for the purpose of fighting. It was animals were baited, and the pit bull clearly was used for fighting. Hundreds of years later, we've now domesticated this animal, and we keep it. And one must bear in mind that no matter how well and we care for this animal, there is always that element of risk, that there is still a degree where this animal can attack a human being. We must, as an owner, you must be mindful of that. So therefore, the risk is therefore transferred onto the owner. The owner bears the risk. He understands the animal, and he must know that no matter how well cared this animal, how well he cares for this animal, there's always a risk. And I just want to appeal as well to the public out there. And we understand that there's been a lot of tragedies over the last 4 months. And I want to appeal to the public not to take the law into their own hands. We've seen a lot of pit bulls that were burnt and stabbed and stoned. And we want to remind the public that there is a better way of dealing with this. And the SPCA will gladly come out, and we will try. And that taking the law into your own hands is actually a criminal offense. To harm an animal, regardless of what the animal has done, is a criminal offense.
Some very sober words there. Thank you very much. And any contact details that you'd like to leave with the general public if they need to find out more?
Yes, so the public can contact us on 011 907 3590, and our website is www.nspca.co.za, and our email address is nspca@nspca.co.za.
Thank you so much for being available. I think if we can ask your colleague, Mr. Voliter, if there are any points that you'd like to make.
Thank you, Joanne. I can't really add too much to what Naz has already said. Apart from, again, we can't expect wildlife to be kept in residential areas and in situations where they're not conducive to the absolute overall health of the animal, whether mental, physical, physiological. That's got to be the consideration in everything. And nothing looks after wildlife better than nature itself. So it's best to leave those animals there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Vanessa, I see you have a hand up.
We have one more question in the Q&A box.
All right. Let's have a look at that before I give Lungelo an opportunity. All right, this is actually then for Douglas Voliter. what's the rule around keeping of wild animals? And I assume that this is in an environment that's not necessarily a formalized zoo or wildlife park. Cliff Graham, maybe if you wanted to expand on that, but let's hand over then to Mr. Voliter.
Thank you. Nice question there, Cliff. The law really protects indigenous animals when you're looking at nature conservation ordinances. In terms of exotics, there's very little protection afforded in terms of from nature conservation laws. Apart from that, like I explained earlier about an import permit from one province to another, and then of course CITES applications when it comes to international trade. In terms of indigenous animals, you have to have a permit, no matter what indigenous animal you're keeping. And we're seeing it a lot with tortoises. People love to keep tortoises in their yards. You have to have a permit. You can't just keep a tortoise. And tortoises have an extremely varied diet. So you actually can't just feed a lettuce, one of the worst things to feed a tortoise. So when we're looking at those laws, nature conservation ordinances, that kind of fail them a little bit. In terms of welfare, though, the Animals Protection Act protects all animals, irrespective of whether it's exotic, indigenous, wild, or domestic. I hope that explains. Thank you.
Right. Thank you so much. Lungelo Mokoena, some final words from you in terms of what would be a good legal approach for us to be looking at.
I think more than anything, there needs to be a general just development of legislation insofar as animals are concerned. Now, the law does develop throughout the years. So I think the development is very important, as well as the tightening of the laws in respect to animals. You know, there should be stricter and harsher measures that the law imposes on violators of animals, and in that there will be respect for animals. We'll see these cases where people are taking the law into their own hands. I think mine is just from a development standpoint and a tightening of the laws.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I see there is possibly one more question. All right, that's Cliff saying thank you very much for that answer on the keeping of wild animals and the roles and responsibilities around that. So I think that in closing today's webinar, we'd like to thank all of our panelists for bringing a sense of the responsibilities and the laws and the recourse that we have, but also very important for us as citizens to be aware of the fact that animals should not be treated as simply a single-minded means of attack, as something that can just be left and not cared for, that animals really have rights and a place in society, but that we as human beings really need to be sensitive to the fact that animals do need us to consider them, to care for them, and to be responsible owners, to ensure that when we take on an animal, that we're really aware of the necessities of that animal, that we're aware of the general nature of these animals, and that we are bringing them into an environment that we are ultimately responsible for, and therefore we are ultimately responsible in ensuring that they don't become a problem for people around us. So we'd like to thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and we hope that the webinar has placed some light on some of the very difficult and emotional issues surrounding this, and we certainly hope that legislation can be brought in to provide protection for human beings and for animals. So thank you very much. For any further queries, you're welcome to send questions or requests for contact details to the RSVP address on the initial invite, and Vanessa will then be able to redirect your questions. Let's take a last look. Vanessa, are there any more hands that we need to address?
There are no hands.
All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much once again. And safe journey, safe travels, and give your pets all the love and attention that they really deserve. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for
Bye.
joining us, to our panelists.